The light of God is the human soul, seeking out the inner chambers of the human heart.
Whew.
Yeah, Proverbs 20:27.
I think I need a minute.
Yeah, right?
After hearing that.
There are many ways up the mountain of spiritual truth. And in this podcast with Rabbi Mordecai Finley, we explore the Kabbalah. And this is an ancient system that has deep, deep mystical wisdom. So if you're looking for a complete map about the way to understand the self and the self's interaction with the divine, this podcast is absolutely incredible. I can't wait for you all to have a listen.
The truth is that we're all the master, we're all the healer, we're all the mystic.
Give it up one time for Aubrey Marcus.
Rabbi Finley.
Hey, man. Great to meet you.
It's great to meet you too.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Great.
So I wanted to start this by expressing, as I was earlier, that I am by genetics, 87% Ashkenazi Jew, and by family tradition, one side of my family was practicing and the other, gave up the practice. But what I found as I went into Judaism is it was beautiful for bringing the family together. It was beautiful to have common rituals that kind of everybody got together and was doing the same thing. And there was this very warm family spirit. But as I've gone on my spiritual path, I've realized that I was missing the essence of deep spirituality. And it felt like the husk that was missing the corn of God in a lot of the practices. So I just kind of left the practice entirely. And recently, partly from reading Steve Pressfield's books and being like, there's something really interesting here. And then going a little bit deeper, I've started to see, as with most things, there's a deep mystical pathway, a bridge to the divine if you follow it. So what I'm really excited to talk to you about is to really go deeper into that bridge that Judaism can provide and see, where it ultimately leads when you have that discerning eye that has felt the heart of God and can find the way through this path.
All right. So how many days do we have here?
Let's go, however long it takes.
All right. Well, the most important thing, I think, in studying a tradition is to be able to understand poetry, metaphors, myths, and symbols. And once you begin to understand the metaphoric, mythic, symbolic nature of consciousness, then you look at the tradition and you see the tradition is mediating between consciousness and the soul. So I'll give you a little example. So you've seen the phylacteries, the tefillin that an Orthodox Jew puts on their arm?
No, I'm not familiar.
Okay. So I'll start with something less arcane. Let's just think of Shabbat,
okay,
the Sabbath.
Yep.
So when you look at the 10 commandments, by the way, in the Jewish enumeration, the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's the first commandment. So how could that be a commandment? So part of what God is saying is, I'm operating on the idea of human liberty, and you're my test case, right? I went into Egypt so the world will know for all times that slavery is a moral offense against God. And people say, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. I said, it's not about that. It's about the God of the universe humbled the king of Egypt,
right,
and brought out a slave people. And God said, I love the slave people. I don't love the pyramids. I don't love the emperors. I love these slaves. And I'm going to turn these slaves into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the first thing God says is, let's get something straight here. I'm the Lord you God who rescued you from Egypt. You need to know that was I that went in there. So when I think of that, I think of the power of the idea of liberty, the power of the idea of human freedom. So over and over again, when you see through the world, what has been the most transformative power? Maybe not God's will, but a godly idea that people have died for, formed countries around, gone into other places and guaranteed the freedom of other people. So the first commandment, which I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So that's the starting place.
right.
And then God says, and no other gods before me. Don't play around with this. I'm claiming you. And when you talk about me, don't do it in a vain way. Do not take my name in vain. And then God says, honor the Sabbath. So God says, we have to have a regular meeting time. You're going to devote a day of the week where we're going to commune with each other. Now, the Bible basically says, don't do labor, toil, but it's not very specific on exactly what you do on the Sabbath day. That's where the rabbis of the Talmudic period filled in. But just think for a moment that I say to people, keep the Sabbath for 1 hour. Keep it for 30 minutes. But one day a week, devote yourself to whatever one understands God to be, however God speaks to you. Make sure so that you devote some of that day to that. And the nice thing is, we do it as a community. Like it's a rolling 24-hour Sabbath observance. So no matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, I know where somewhere across the globe at that moment, somebody else is doing something like what I'm doing. So when you think of the Sabbath not as, oh my God, I can't watch, I'm a Reformed rabbi, so I don't have that many restrictions. So I'm more on the positive side.
Sure.
So we light candles and we do a Sabbath dinner and study Torah, and we just make sure that one day of the week we elevate things a little bit. So start there. What does it mean to have time devoted to God? And what does it mean to live life on an elevated level with your community? So.
It's so much about intention. There's ways to connect to God in so many different ways. It could be the Zen way of a tea ceremony, where you're connecting in that present moment and seeing as you whisk that masha, connecting to the plants that actually made the leaves and the sun that shone down and the water that rained them, and then how that interacts with your divine being, and just being truly present in that. That's an act of worship. That is a way, one pathway to do it. But it is very much about finding the intention there.
Well, that's the exact word. In Hebrew, the word is kavanah, Kavanah. So kavanah means intentionality. So there's an argument in the Talmud whether all commandments, the fulfilling of commandments, require kavanah, like kol mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Some say, no, you just do it and you get points for obedience. There's a whole other side that says if you don't fill the observance with kavanah, it's empty. It's almost an affront to the divine. So the tradition that guides me the most, the Hasidic tradition, that is really the emphasis. If you're going to do something, do it with full intentionality.
Yeah.
So that's what I say to people. I say, it doesn't matter what level your observance is, as long as what you do, you fill it with intentionality.
Yeah. And there's another interesting thing that's there, because in some ways you can say God is everything. God is all things. There is no thing other than God. God loves all things. But that only works in one specific, understanding of dimensionality. Like we have to translate that all the way down to the 3D. And in the 3D, there are things that are far more in divine accord, like the principles of liberty, like the principles of freedom. And so there needs to be a translation of like, what are the principles that we can actually live by? Because it's not really helpful to say all is God and God loves everything. Well, okay, great. That's good to know. But punching somebody is not as nice as hugging them. Like clearly, like the divine is far more in the process of hugging than striking for no reason or whatever, because ultimately, to do that, you're in the delusion that somebody is truly separate from you or not as real or deserving of this. So it's very difficult to be in the presence of the divine and doing one of these things, like enslaving somebody, like, manipulating them or hurting them in some way. So there's this important translation from this kind of unicity consciousness down to, all right, what are some ways in which, some guidelines that we can understand how to live our life in divine accord?
Very well put. So you might say there are levels of consciousness, and every level of consciousness is tuning into a different level of reality. So one level of consciousness is the consciousness that all is God, and our souls are connected to the soul of the universe. That is one level of consciousness. But then the further down you go, you realize, well, there are evil people, and there are destructive tendencies in every human being. So they don't deny each other. It's where you're tuning in. So one part of my day, I might tune into the fullness of the divine presence. Another part of my day, I might tune into the reality of human evil. Another part of my day might be tuned into the destructiveness of my own nature. And they're all real. They're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
So when people say, well, which level of consciousness? I said, well, which level of consciousness is required right now?
Right.
So if right now what's required is helping somebody overcome their destructive inner forces, that's the reality I'm living in when I'm working with myself. It's another kind of reality I'm living in. So You have to tune your consciousness to what the present requires of you.
I think a lot of times this creates what seems like a paradox, but it's only a paradox because you're speaking about different levels of consciousness, and those different levels of consciousness have different understandings that actually make sense. So there can be something that's inherently paradoxical, like saying, God isn't in the pyramids and doesn't love the pharaohs and these things. Well, okay, yes, on this level of consciousness, absolutely true, because they're out of divine accord. They're not in the essence and presence of the divine as they're doing these things. However, in another level, of course, they are, right? So it creates this interesting paradox that actually dissolves when you start to separate them by, okay, just which level of consciousness are we talking about, which takes a little bit of precision in your understanding.
Precisely. And so I've had friends who are more into the God is all. And the interesting thing is they were very dogmatic about it, and I would say, hey man, let's loosen up here.
Yeah.
I understand that God is all, but there's also evil, and pyramids are beautiful, and they were built by slaves.
Yeah.
So both are true. They're beautiful, and slaves built them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's figure out what we're talking about. Are we talking about the beauty of geometric forms? I'm all over that. Study Pythagoras and the beauty of sacred geometry. I can talk about that. And then we'll talk about human subjugation. It's just two different conversations, and they don't exclude each other. So oftentimes when I'm talking to somebody, I say, which level of consciousness are we on? Because we don't need to argue about which level of consciousness is like the right one, because I think they're all tapped into some level of reality. So I just want to know, what are we talking about? Right. Let's talk about that.
Right.
And not say, well, my level is better than your level.
Yeah, that you create this kind of hierarchy of, oh, well, in this level, this is better. But it's not actually helpful to create any hierarchy. Actually, the moment you're creating a hierarchy, you're actually putting yourself in a lower level of consciousness anyways, right? Like they're almost self-defeating in that attack.
At the moment, when you're struggling with yourself, that's at the top of the hierarchy, because if a person's struggling with themselves, they would say, but God made me. So obviously God wanted me this way. I said, at one level of consciousness, that's true, but I am not letting you off the hook, because you're not going to do that fallback position when it's convenient. If you want to say God made me, then let's have that conversation. Right now, you are acting out of accord with divine nature. And that's the problem we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at the moment, if you're an authentic person working on an authentic problem, that's at the top of the hierarchy right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might switch. And so what you don't do is say, as you're saying, the only thing we should be talking about is all is God. I said, maybe not, but depending on what problem we're trying to solve.
Right. When you go into the Kabbalah, which is really, and I'll allow you to explain it, but it seems like from what I've heard you talk about it and the little bit that I know, which I know very little about it, it seems like it starts to become a translation of like how to translate these ideas and philosophies and understandings into practice, in some way a pragmatic approach, if you can actually understand what all of these different things are talking about.
It can be. To be honest, a book like the Zohar, which is the founding document of the Kabbalah, it's almost impenetrable for a non-expert. It is esoteric. It is mystical. It is not practical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is a map to the mind of God for the initiated. What happened in the 1700s is the Hasidic tradition tried to translate the mysteries of the Kabbalah into a practical spiritual psychology. So, I know Kabbalah, I can teach the Zohar, but my main interest is making it applicable to the spiritual psychology of human beings. So a little bit about the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah comes into being in the late 1100s, early 1200s in the south of France and in Spain. And it rests on ancient traditions that probably go back, to the Greeks, to the Egyptians, to the Sumerians, which basically sees reality as having higher and lower dimensions. So if you go to Plato, for example, he has the idea of the ideal forms. So there's an ideal form of justice, a metaphysical idea that we human beings can barely articulate, but we have a sense when something's not right, something's not fair. And someone says, well, define right, define fair. Good luck with that. I mean, it's just not fully definable, but we know what we're talking about. And then from Plato's perspective, it emanates into human consciousness. Now, Plato wasn't the first person to think about this, nor his teacher Socrates, and we actually don't know who the first person is, because we don't have written records that go back that far. That the divine emanates metaphysical truths into human consciousness. So that's the core idea, and you'll find that idea more or less an organizing idea of Western civilization.
Yeah. Eventually you end up with, and another problem is eventually you end up with words, which is an emblemization, a condensation of an idea that can never carry the truth of the idea. And then the words become the codex by which we actually form thoughts.
Yeah.
So it's almost impossible. But the point that you're using a word, you're really in a challenging spot, because you almost have to transcend the words to even get anywhere close to what the actual idea is.
There's a Hasidic practice called hitbonenut, which means the Hebrew word lahavin means to understand, and lihitbonen means to take understanding and apply it within. And there's a practice called meditation on holy words. And the idea that every word is like an opening to a cave. And inside the cave, there are worlds and souls and angels. And you enter from the surface to the word into this inexhaustible, stunning majesty of the interior of consciousness. And it doesn't end. Mm-hmm. But then you come out and you're at the surface of the word. So exactly as you're saying, words mediate between consciousness and the soul. So therefore, one of the worst things we can do is like the literalization of words. Words stand for have metaphysical dimensions, have soul dimensions. So this is a Hasidic practice that, I stumbled into it on my own, and then I actually found out it's been a Hasidic practice for a couple of hundred years. This is one of the things that got me really interested in Hasidism. So exactly as you're saying, this goes back to our earlier thought that when you look at traditions and so forth, you have to see the inner kavanah, the inner intention. Well, it's the same thing with language and words. So the Kabbalah is very aware of that. So the Kabbalah has a system of these 10 emanations, and so people want to know what the labels are. And I say, they're just labels. The meaning of it is not in the label. The meaning of it is when you sink yourself deeply into it and you immerse yourself in it. And then you find the interconnections between the 10. You have to go in with a certain kind of consciousness. Then you come out, and then whatever your tradition is, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Secular, whatever it is, but bring some of that insight into whatever you're doing.
Let's talk about these emanations, and let's see if we can dive a little deeper and explore some of these caves. Okay, all right. Well, the top three, I'll just give you the normative order, even though different systems name them differently. Because remember, they came into being organically in the south of France, north of Spain. They weren't issued as dogma. People figured them out. Mm-hmm. So there's what I would call the majority opinion on the labels, and I differ with other rabbis. So I'm in one school of thought how to label them. So I just want to make you aware and make your audience aware. There are the differences are not huge, but they're there. So the first three are the most mystical. Okay, so the first one is, the label is crown, keter, crown, but the nickname of it is Ein Sof, which is the infinite. Mm. Another name of it is machshava, which is the divine mind. So that really is the center of mystical experience. I only teach that to people at a more advanced level. The next one is called chokhmah, which means wisdom, but as a concept, it means the generative point. Like in a geometry analogy, you know how like a point has no substance until it becomes a line? Right. So the point out of which everything flows. So you go from the infinite to the singular point of the origin of consciousness. That's number two. Number three is called binah, literally means understanding, but in Kabbalah they call it the quarry, which means once the point generates reality. So those top three, keter, chokhmah, binah, crown, wisdom, discernment, what they really mean is infinity, generative point, construction of reality. Yeah. So you have to understand not the label, but when you look at Kabbalah, how the Kabbalah understands what's behind the label. So the top three are really at the mystical level. The bottom seven are the more spiritual, psychological. And that's what I spend most of my time teaching, is the lower seven sfirot, because they directly apply to human spiritual psychology. Well, let's play around with these first three. Okay. In the first place. So It seems like there's a corollary between what many people would call the crown chakra, which is your connection to the divine, and also potentially what comes to mind to me is, Atman and Brahman, the idea that there's the universal God, and then there's the Godhead within, the Atman, which is still the Brahman. Atman is Brahman, like this idea that this is our access point to the infinite, but it's still infinite. It's we're not a drop in the ocean, we're the ocean in a drop. This kind of idea from Rumi.
Very well put.
That we have this access, which is very difficult to understand because it's fractal. It's like
it's beyond understanding. That's why, when people ask me, what do I mean by the Ein Sof, the infinite, I say, an unbearably luminous obsidian density, infinite in expansion. And they say, I don't understand what you just said. I said, it's not supposed to be understandable.
Yeah.
It's the deepest darkness. It's the
You
greatest.
asked for words.
You asked for
I
words.
gave you
I
them.
gave you some words. Okay.
Do you like them? Here you go.
There you go.
You want to make your own? Go for it.
There you go. People say, well, it makes my brain hurt. I said, exactly. Anything to break the confines of language, then you're projected into mystical consciousness. And then when you come back, it's as if your consciousness says, what just happened? So all you have are metaphors. All you have are oxymorons. So that's why mystics use metaphors and oxymorons to break the confines of consciousness. So that's when I say the Ein Sof, people say, oh, infinite. I said, don't think of infinite extension. Everybody thinks like when they say infinite, they think ongoing. I say, think of infinite density. Think of infinite brilliance. Think of infinite darkness. Think of infinite everything. And then go there. And then when you come back, tell me what it was like using the best metaphors you can come up with. So that's in a way, when I try to teach the Ein Sof, which is, look, you're a natural. I mean, I'm really impressed. I mean, I just arrived in this room and I'm sitting here with a mystic. So it's right on.
I've had
man.
a lot of help.
That's good because it's authentic. I mean, I can tell you've mastered the consciousness and mastered the terminology. But see, I deal with beginners. I used to teach at a rabbinical school, and people could become rabbis for all kinds of reasons. So they'd come to my mysticism class, my Kabbalah class, and some said, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right.
So I gotta slow it way down.
Sure.
And kind of appeal. Have you ever had that moment when you pull up in the driveway and just before you get out of your car and it's night and the stars and you're there and the home and the family and your life and your past, your present, your future. And you have this moment where reality shudders through you and you say, what just happened? What just happened? And then I say, so capture that moment. Live inside that moment. Everybody has one of those, but they don't know how to name it, so they just forget about it. So teaching this to a beginner is not easy.
Yeah.
And that's why I more or less reserve the upper three sphirot for people who have some background in how to manage mystical consciousness.
Well, my path has taken me through the plant medicine path and working with some of the great masters who've carried this tradition, lineages from ancient Chavin to, the jungles of Peru to different places. And what's happened is that there's the language and the concept, and then there's the somatic experience of the thing when the full evaporation happens and all of a sudden you've been using the word God for your whole life, and then you feel God, and then you say, oh, God, God, and then you understand it with, it becomes a gnosis rather than a knowing with a K, and then you really feel what it's like. And that's been exceptionally helpful. And what it's allowed is for the exploration of these different maps and for me to be able to apply meaning like, oh, I know that. I've felt that thing and I've been there and I've found, I understand what that is from a sensation in myself, a knowing that comes from within. And that's been really helpful.
That's beautifully put. So that's how I described the Kabbalah. I said it's a map that maps out human consciousness and divine and the experience of the divine. And the worth of a map is how well it helps you negotiate the terrain.
Right.
So the Kabbalah is not better or worse than any other map. The question is, pragmatically, does it lead you where you want to go? So for me, it's an extremely good map. I've studied a lot of traditions. I have a doctorate in religion, social ethics. So it was more on moral philosophy on one hand and symbolic nature of consciousness on the other. But I've studied other religions, and what I realized, every religion has a map.
Yeah.
And so I'm born into the Jewish tradition, and I wanted to know my tradition. So I ended up, I'll tell you how I came to know Kabbalah. Okay, so I'm an undergraduate in religion. I'm 23. I'm an older undergraduate because I spent 3 years in the military and a year on a kibbutz. So the professor, who's a expert in Eastern mysticism, he says to me, he says, look, I have to give a lecture on the Kabbalah, and I really don't get it. So I'll give you an A in the course if you read this book on the Kabbalah and you give the lecture. So I read this book called Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, and I'm reading through one chapter after the other. After I get to the Kabbalah, I'm transfixed. Then I get to the chapter on the Lurianic Kabbalah. I'm in. Then I get to the chapter on Hasidism. I'm done. Right? And I had a conversion experience preparing for that class. And I said, wow, I think I'm a Hasidic Lurianic Kabbalist. And I never went back. I'm reading an academic book, getting ready to give a lecture. And it just unfolded. It unfolded. The words connected me to the divine in the most unimaginable way. So why do I believe in Hasidic Lurianic Kabbalah? Because it worked.
Yeah.
Because it got me there.
It's almost like there's this this vibration that comes through, and it found resonance where all of the molecules, even though your mind doesn't have molecules, but the molecules of your mind and soul started vibrating, and it made a clear tone, a clear note.
That's well put. So however consciousness comes from the brain to the mind, I shuddered when I read the book. And so when I assigned the book, I don't even assign it anymore because most students find it too dense. I found it gripping. It was like reading a thriller. So yeah, I shuddered. I absolutely shuddered with the book in my hand.
Yeah.
And when truth comes off the page and grabs you by the lapels and looks you in the eye, so it's like, okay, I'm in. So that was my first deep experience of the Kabbalah, was reading Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom Scholem, who published it in 1941. Somebody said to Gershom Scholem, do you believe in this stuff? He goes, no, I don't believe in it. I'm just a scholar.
But he was tapped in, apparently.
He was tapped in far more than he would admit.
Yeah. Going to the second emanation, what comes to mind for me is that there's, in that moment of separation, we become a perspective in the mind of God. Mm-hmm. Like we're just a locus, a perspective. Mm-hmm. And we fill in the perspective with all kinds of things, but it's like the declaration point of perspective is like it was one level.
The perspective would more be the third one, where reality is constructed. So the second one, chokhmah, is the moment when you identify with a generative point. There's no extension yet. There's no human thought yet. It's just the moment when you realize you're a generative point between the infinite and the human. And so chokhmah, it translates as wisdom, but it's a label for something that we wouldn't call wisdom. It's a mystical center point of mystical consciousness. Now, wisdom is found in the lower 7 sphirot, meaning wisdom as far as how to think well and solve problems and understand the human condition. So chokhmah is very confusing to people because you slip right through it.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's almost, I guess, in my own practices, it seems to me that there was a decision point where God was the void and God said yes. It doesn't say anything, but there was just like a yes. And in this yes, it became the active principle. It went from the yin principle to the yang principle. Yeah. And the yes was the source point of emanation, which became articulation.
Okay, so you're going to love this tradition. Right. So it says in the 10 commandments, where the people say to Moses, don't let God talk to us anymore. We're going to die. You get it and bring it to us. So the Talmud says, well, how much did God say to the people before they said stop? So some people say, God only spoke the first commandment. They said stop. So of course the next one says, God only said the first word, which is Anochi, I. And then one said, God only said the first letter, which is the silent aleph. So all God said was,
yep. And when God says that.
Yeah, when God says silence, the aleph, which is unpronounceable.
Yeah.
Then the extension of the S, would be bina.
Right.
Bina.
Already moving into
It's already moving into the
third
construction
emanation.
of reality. Yeah. So that's why the Keter, Ein Sof, is the beyond infinite, and then Chokhmah is the point that mediates between infinite consciousness and human consciousness.
Yeah. And then the third emanation, you arrive at perspective.
Yeah, you arrive at the construction of consciousness, and it's not. It comes down to language. I mean, when the Hasidic masters get to Binah, they say when you study the interior of holy words, that's where you're heading. You're heading into the interior of language. You're with language, but you're in the interior of language. So many Hasidic practices take you into Binah, interior language, which then kick you into Chokhmah, the generative point of consciousness, which then take you into Ein Sof, the infinite of the divine mind. So it's, programmatically, it's from the infinite to the generative point to the quarry of language, but experientially, it goes a little bit the other way.
Right.
You go into the quarry of language of Binah, into the generative point of Chokhmah, and then ascend into the Ein Sof.
Right. It's almost like retracing the steps, back up the mountain from
Exactly right.
what came down the mountain.
Yeah. So that's it's a Hasidic practice. I will teach it to advanced students, and I just actually did a whole, from October till March, I taught this, the classic Hasidic text on this practice. We got 6 pages into 138 page text.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, it was deep, man.
And there's always, and I'm sure even for you, you go in, every time you go in, there's always another layer. One of my spiritual mentor, one of them, Don Howard Lawler, who spent 50 years bringing the Shavin practice of serving Wachuma, which is a plant medicine that's very heart opening and, several thousand-year-old practice. And he spent his time, and that was always the thing he said. It's like, no matter how far you've gone, there's always another layer. There's always a place where you can go even deeper. Yeah. It's infinite.
Absolutely. So when I was teaching this text, I had extraordinary experiences.
Yeah.
First, it's during COVID, so it's on Zoom, but then actually our faces are closer to each other than in a classroom.
Sure.
And I would, and then we'd read a line, the Hebrew, and I had an English translation, and they'd say, explain it again. And I'd have to go into the deepest parts of myself to try to convey it. And it works. When you go into the depth of a mystical text where the author's been there, and then they're trying to lead you into the quarry, into the generative point, into the infinite mind of God. Well, I can't teach it if I'm not doing it, almost like real time.
Sure.
I can't teach it academically. I have to teach it in reality. So it became, some nights it was unbearable to teach the class. It's like, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So that's the realist. Again, in the map of the Kabbalah, the upper 3 sfirot, Bina, I'm going backwards now, Bina, Chokhmah, Ein Sof, that's where mystical consciousness is.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, well, let's break it down to some more of the pragmatic wisdom that's carried in.
So the first 2 of the lower 7 are called chesed, which means loving kindness. And then its mate is gevura. They're right across from each other. If you look up sfirot, in a search engine, and you put images, you'll find the classic 10 emanation diagram of the Kabbalah. So you see the upper 3. Then right under them, you'll see chesed, which means loving kindness, and gevura, which literally means strength. However, as concepts, you might say loving kindness begins in as it were, force. How you relate to the world. So the way that I teach chesed is there are lower levels of chesed and higher levels of chesed. So a lower level of chesed would be, for example, love as manipulation. Love as trying to extract reciprocity. Love as pure formalism. And then when you go, what I call, it's a vertical metaphor. You can say either the deeper, the higher. Then you go into love as absorbing the presence of another human being. Love as service. Love as, Martin Buber would call it the I-thou moment, the ish und du, the deep moment. So when I teach chesed, we have to go on either layers of depth or a vertical metaphor.
Is the language becomes difficult at that point because there is an argument to be made that at the point that you're doing something for manipulation, doing something for validation, doing something for the ends, not the means of loving? Is it actually love or kindness at that point? Or
It
is
goes
it
under the label.
Right.
That's the problem, because people will say, sometimes when I'm like a real beginner, what I realize is person A's version of love is, now that I love you, here's what you must do.
Yeah.
And that becomes clear super quick.
Right.
And then I say, well, think about love as service, not what they're supposed to do for you. People say, shouldn't my wife do this? Shouldn't my husband do that? I said, I don't know. Let's not talk about them. Let's talk about you. What should you be doing?
Right.
And this idea of it's not about demands. It's not about entitlements. It's a whole other thing going on. So they come in, they say, I love my family. Why don't they do this for me?
Yeah.
And so there's a restructuring of consciousness. So I'm thinking chesed. I got to move them from the lower to the higher, or from the surface to the depth, however, whatever metaphor you want to use.
I guess it's valuable in that way to keep it under the same label, because that's the label that people are using
Precisely.
anyways. So they're saying like, I love you, but there's levels to that, and there's levels to the meaning of that. And by allowing it to remain and saying that's not really love.
Or it's not the higher level or the deeper level.
Yeah. So it allows them to kind of explore that with and really understand and redefine the same thing for themselves.
That's exactly right. And that's the benefit of using these emanations. We can stay in the language game of chesed. And so when they say, I love this, I love that, we'll stay right in there. And then my job is to bring, myself, first of all. I mean, all this begins in self-psychology. And if I do that well, then I can bring it to somebody else and what it means to take it to a deeper level or a higher level. But then its sister, it's right across, it's called Gevura, which literally means strength. But conceptually, at a higher level means rationality, good judgment, good boundary setting. And at the lower level, it's rigidness, hatred, prejudice. But if you look at, they all use the word judgment. There's good judgment and there's judgmentalism. There's good boundary setting, and then there's rigidity. So again, we stay in the conceptual world of Gevura so that we can discuss all the levels of it. So yeah, you got it exactly right. The efficiency of the Sfirot is you get to stay within one conceptual framework as you move through them.
When describing it using the label strength, when really it seems like it's more like judgment.
Correct.
But that's just the translation. But it's
So in some systems, it's called din, which is an Aramaic word that actually means judgment.
Yeah.
But almost universally, if you looked it up, you would see Gevura, which means strength. But remember, it's just a label.
Yeah.
So when people say, well, why is it called strength? I said, it's just a label. Why is a chaise lounge called a chaise lounge? I don't know. Like, I know what I do with it.
A credenza? I don't know.
Exactly.
I still don't know what a credenza is.
I don't know what a credenza is, but I think if someone says that's my credenza, I'm not going to say what, right? So it's just a label. I don't get hung up on the label. Like, let's go into the interior. So how do you discover the interior? Well, you study text. You study the Zohar. You study the Hasidic literature, and you see how it's used. I mean, this goes, if you know the great Austrian-British philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. I mean, he said, consciousness works with concepts. Consciousness works with our building reality with language. And we shouldn't just look at language as if it names something, but it helps us organize consciousness. So I remind people, don't get hung up on the label. So the interior of Gevura is judgment, going from good judgment, rationality, good boundary setting. And by the way, for many really loving people, their worst quality is bad judgment. Isn't that crazy? Like, there are such loving people, and they almost always get things wrong.
I mean, there's that classic saying, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions.
That's exactly right.
So, which is just bad judgment. They're just saying, I really want to help, but I'm actually not helping anything
Exactly.
at all.
I mean, they don't know that they're enabling.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's fascinating. For some people, they got to get from lower chesed to higher chesed. Other people, it's not that they're hateful and prejudiced. For example, sometimes when I think of Gevura din, strength, judgment, I'll call it judgment for now. There's two sides to lower judgment. One is bad judgment, and one is judgmentalism. And judgmentalism is the source of evil. When you think about it, judgmentalism is, I'm judging you to be wrong. I'm judging you to be bad. I'm judging you to be subhuman. I'm judging you to be not worthy of human life. So,
which then becomes the justification for all sorts of
for all
heinous
kinds
acts.
of, exactly.
And it's very rare that a human can escape some kind of justification. I mean, we think of the worst of us that have ever, and I say us, capital U, the worst of all humans of all time. Even Hitler had his rationality.
That's exactly right.
And he was the worst of us.
That's exactly right. So how do you know when a person is hiding, where they don't let other people talk? Because what's the first thing Hitler did? He shut down the free press.
Sure.
Took over the school system. So they say, well, how do I know when I'm thinking well, when I'm not thinking well? I said, do you invite dissent? Do you invite an interlocutor and say, please challenge me, make me honest? So that's one of the, this is a very Talmudic idea, is open discourse. Like, I'm going to make a point, you respond, and the truth will come out of honest, respectful dialogue. So truth is discovered between people. It's not a stable thing. So when people say, how do I know? I say, well, there's a wisdom tradition of people who have struggled with these issues, and they finally come out with a statement. For example, like the book of Proverbs in the Bible. So some of the book Proverbs I like and some I don't like. But then I come across one that really sinks in. And I said, well, is naming something true? Then I run it by somebody. I said, what do you think about this? And then we talk about it, because maybe I'm not understanding it. Maybe it sounds like the good word and it's not the good word. So at the higher levels of really getting into rationality always means testing your ideas with reality and with other people. And the first clue that someone is not acting in higher gevura is they don't let other people talk.
This is one of the challenges that I see with the world right now.
Absolutely.
Is that there's so much censorship happening and so much shutting down of ideas, and someone expresses someone, and if that idea is unpopular, people don't say, well, let me understand what you mean by this. They're saying, cancel, block,
I completely
censor.
agree with you.
It's like, whoa. Like, let's all hear each other out. Let's open this conversation and say, these words are clumsy little things. Let's see what the intention was, and let's try to understand all of this.
I completely agree with you. And so sometimes when I say, let's not cancel that person, they said, do you agree with them? I said, no, I don't agree with them, but I like to hear them make their point so I can maybe debate them. And, and there's something in there they're trying to get out oftentimes.
Sure.
There's something in there.
And they may not even be aware of it. And by opening the dialogue and hearing them and listening, say, I hear you, and here's my thoughts. You have the opportunity to change them.
One of my favorite examples of this is, when I would say this to people, how can you even talk to these people? I said, there's like a black guy in Georgia or somewhere, and he would meet Klansmen, and he would say, meet with me. And he would dialogue with them, and eventually they give him their hood, their Klan hood. Right? Okay?
Powerful.
Right? So somebody said, how can you talk with them? He says, how many hoods do you have in your closet? So
That's the gangsterest thing to say.
Isn't it?
That's the gangsterest thing to say.
So he has a closet filled with Klan hoods, because once they come around, he says, give me your hood.
Right.
And so he says, how many hoods do you have in your closet?
Wow.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So I read that and I thought, man, that nailed it. So when people say to me, how can you talk to these people? I said, somebody has to talk to them.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's such a powerful thing. And in the occasions where someone said something incredibly hateful to me online, and every once in a while I'll sense something and I'll just have a feeling, like, a lot of times I don't engage, but every once in a while I'll just dive in and I'll engage with them. And there's been really powerful moments where I got the metaphorical hood of that hatred. Right. When it was really like, hey man, and eventually they'll be like, hey man, I'm sorry about that. I've just really had a hard time, and I was projecting a lot of this stuff. And it's really potent when that happens, and it's like, it's very rewarding. And sometimes it doesn't go anywhere that way. They're very entrenched in their ideas, and that's okay too. But maybe that effort of showing them, kindness in that way, which is part of the other emanation, just, okay, I'm going to give you some loving kindness here, and see if that changes. It's your choice. You can hold on to these hateful ideas if you like, or you could revise them.
Well, you've intuitively grasped why Chesed and Gevura are connected.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the way to lead a person to higher rationality and judgment is through Chesed, is through loving kindness. And sometimes you bring a person to higher levels of love is through rationality. Yeah. Like an enabler. But I'm doing it from love. I said, let's talk rationally about what the consequences of the way you show your love are. So have a rational discussion about what you're doing and what happened next. And then the person says, yeah, I'm not helping, am I? Right? There's a better way to love. And one way to love is not being an enabler. So it's interesting that chesed and gevura, loving kindness and good judgment, they're actually in a constant dance with each other.
Yeah.
And so I always teach them as a pair.
It's also interesting to think that, a lot of these concepts, I think we can sometimes feel like, oh man, humans just figured this out. Like we just figured this thing out, and no, this was written in the 1100s, 1200s, and they put them next to each other for a reason. There was deep, deep wisdom that was carried in a lot of these maps that when you actually start to think, oh yeah, all of these new books that are coming out and these new ideas, they're not new ideas. They're actually they've been talked about for many, many years, sometimes thousands of years.
Exactly. So the Kabbalah is rooted in, a Jewish form of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. I mean, the most efficient definition of Kabbalah is it's the intersection between Jewish Neoplatonism and Jewish Gnosticism. So that's if you know those words, then you really get what the Kabbalah is trying to do. It's trying to deal with the emanatory nature of consciousness and the fact of evil at the same time.
Yeah.
And Platonism and Gnosticism don't go well together, because one believes evil is the absence of the good, and the other one believes evil is real. And so the Kabbalah says, well, they're both true. So let's work with that. So that goes all the way back into the ancient world of Platonism and Gnosticism that were part of our heritage from the Greeks and also in the Bible. I mean, they're operating in two different places, in the Mediterranean, and coming to very similar grasps of reality. I have a feeling that the what we call the Middle Eastern civilization and the Mediterranean civilization, they were in touch with each other in ways that we just don't know because we don't have written records.
Right.
But then you go back, for example, the book of Proverbs. Sometimes I'll say a new book, and I just say, well, that's actually an entire commentary on one line of Proverbs. There's, again, I don't like every proverb, but the ones I do like, one of my favorite ones is Proverbs chapter 20, verse 27, where it says, the light of God is the human soul, seeking out the inner chambers of the human heart. Whew. Yeah, Proverbs 20, 27.
I think I need a minute.
Yeah, right?
After hearing that. Say that one more time.
Ner Adonai nishmat adam, the light of God is the human soul. Chofesh kol chadrei vaten, seeking out. Cheder means a chamber or a room. Vaten, it means belly, but it also means the inner life. The light of God is the human soul, seeking out the hidden chambers of the human being or the human heart or something like that. So
wow.
that's one of my meditations.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
you can feel that. I could feel that one working. I won't say the second person. I can feel that one working when I hear it. It's like, oh, wow.
Okay. So that's what I chant when my interior chant, for example, when my wife and daughters light Shabbat candles, I'm saying the light of God is the human soul. So I'm adding intentionality to the lighting of Shabbat candles. And so I take that as a moment. My kids are grown up now, but still, I have 4 children. I think of every one of them. I think of their interior nature, and I think of the light of God. And my wife's across from me, and I think, wow, she bears the light of God. Like we're like sojourners on this path together. She's not just my wife. My wife, Meirav, it's like it's another light of God in my life. So just saying the light of God is the human soul. When you light Sabbath candles, it changes the ritual from, okay, I'm observing the Sabbath, to it just orients consciousness. And I try to have that last for the whole 24 hours of Shabbat. And so that is actually my motif for Shabbat. For the 24 hours of Shabbat, the light of God is the human soul. And so it's always the light on, in the back of consciousness as I hope I can live that all week. But one of my favorite Hasidic teachers says that 1/7 of every week should be Shabbat. And 1/7 of every hour, 1/7 of every day should be Shabbat. 1/7 of every hour should be Shabbat. And 1/7 of every second should be Shabbat. Isn't that great?
Yeah. Yeah. That's great because then it's always there. The light is always on.
Yeah. 1/7 of every second.
The light is always on.
The light is on.
So this is speaking to what I was talking about earlier, the way that my family practiced, it was absent of this. And perhaps I couldn't quite grasp it the way I'm grasping it now. Because when, the student is ready, the teaching appears, there's these sayings that this happened. But ultimately, if there was someone who could really embody it as you do and express it, I would have felt something. And then the candles that were lit would have meant something different. And these things could have been an invitation. And maybe I don't take the invitation. Maybe I'm like, yeah, whatever. I want to go see my friends. And I don't take the invitation, but at least the invitation would have been there. And the invitation is to a party that's deep.
That's really great. One thing we said to our kids, they were growing up, you can go out on Friday night. You go to a football game, go to a party, but we're lighting Shabbat candles.
Yeah.
I say, now we light Shabbat candles, go your way.
Yeah.
And so that anchored them through life. Both our daughters served in the Israeli army. So one thing we gave them was portable little, they're like candlesticks, but they're really just like little plates that fold together. And we said, wherever you are on a Friday, pull out a couple of, what they call like tea
light candles.
Tea light candles.
Yeah.
And just always remember you have a soul. So that has anchored, our marriage, our raising of our children. I mean, if there's one metaphor that we've taken throughout our lives, is the light of God is the human soul. So when you're a parent, there's a light of God in your home. So, and I don't fault your family, because this wisdom was almost unavailable in American Judaism. It was all about ethics and keep the tradition and don't marry outside the faith. And there's all this, I'm not saying those things aren't important, but there's something so much more deep, and it wasn't taught.
Yeah.
So I had to discover it myself. I mean, I'm fond of the rabbis that, were the rabbis at my synagogue when I grew up. And by the way, when I do kids' bar and bat mitzvahs in the Hebrew school, like I can't get through to them, right? So, but I just want them to know that Rabbi meant it. I had a rabbi who meant it.
Yeah.
I had a rabbi that my parents thought was a real thing.
Yeah.
A man of spirit. And sometimes I have a kid come back to me 10, 15. I can't, my first pulpit was in 1981, 82 in Irvine. A monthly pulpit. Okay. So my first bat mitzvah that I officiated at was 40 years ago.
Wow.
So this kid is now 54. And I've had people reach out to me in their 40s and 50s and say, Rabbi Finley, can I talk to you? I had a moment, and you were my bar mitzvah rabbi. Now I get you.
Yeah, they're finally ready.
They realize, wow, I kind of remember you. And so I see myself as planting seeds. And I don't either I will water that seed into a plant, or somebody else will. But when you look at yourself back at that age, I don't know if anybody could have said anything to you, but look what you've become.
Sure.
I mean, you took a path into the depths of human consciousness as an act of will. No one made you do this. You chose this life.
Yeah.
It's really, really admirable. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's very, once you get started, I think that's the key thing. Like, you feel something. And my pathway was through a vision quest.
Wow.
And I was, a traditional shaman who took me on a vision quest. And in that vision quest, I ingested psilocybin mushrooms on this vision quest, out with the coyotes howling and the rain swirling. And it was this wild night. And I was absolutely completely agnostic, leaning towards, I don't really believe anything. I wouldn't say atheist, because that's a faith in and of itself, but staunchly agnostic and leaning towards atheist. And then I felt my body evaporate, and I felt what I could only describe as my soul. That was the only word that was available to me. And I was like, oh dear.
How old were you when this happened?
I was 18. I was like, oh dear, this changes everything now. Now I have to rethink my whole mental construct. And I was just like, I had to give it to the fire to be renewed. And since that moment, I could never look away.
See, I had a spiritual teacher in high school who inducted me into a fellowship of it's called the Gurdjieff School of Thought. But he peeled away levels of consciousness in discussion. So I had a similar experience under the able, almost surgical hand of an experienced spiritual teacher. It was not in the curriculum. He was not supposed to be doing this with his students, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, he his method was, I was in his science class, and he would give the talk, and then he'd say something kind of strange and like look right at me. I just remember one when we were talking about spontaneous generation. People didn't know where germs and bacteria came from, so they just thought, well, they just happen. So he said, so the idea behind spontaneous generation is there are realities that we cannot see. And then he'd and then he'd go on with the talk, and he kept doing this. So I came after school one
You're
day.
just looking behind
I just
you like, what is going on here?
So I came after school one day. I said, I have this feeling sometimes you're talking to me. He says, I was waiting for you to notice. He says, yeah, I think you can get this. Do you want to meet with me? And so we scheduled every Wednesday after, I was in 11th grade. We scheduled every Wednesday afternoon in S109, Science Building 109. And I met with him for, mostly every week for almost 2 years.
Wow.
And he was my spiritual mentor. And I had a similar experience to you, except drugs never had that kind of effect on me. In fact, he said I had to stop. You got to stop with the pot and all that. It's just getting in your way. And so he actually made me unusually sober when I was in 12th grade. He said, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
That's like, no more of that, because your mind is, I want you to be 100% present.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Intentionality has so much to it, because he brought the intention of the divine through this and through using language and through his presence. His presence was kind of this light that allowed you to see things. And it was the same with all of my teachers, right? It was never like I just took something in my house and had a
very
thing.
good. So yes, I never had a mentorship.
Right.
With
So,
any of that
and with
stuff.
me, it was always very much that. It was someone with a deep lineage that went a long time back to a tradition that had been alive. And they carried this kind of the same thing, though. They carried the presence, offered the presence and the intentionality through the medicine, and then were there with the medicine and with me.
That's
and
beautiful.
to bring that. And that's always where the most powerful experiences have come from. It's just like this becomes just another avenue and another vehicle.
That's very well put. I mean, I really never thought about that in the 70s, like the revolution was over and we just got the drugs.
Yeah.
But there was no wisdom with the drugs.
Right.
It was just a bunch of teenagers getting high.
Right.
And then I had to stop. But my teacher in high school, Jack Bishop, one thing I did to clean myself up was go in the Marines. And then I found a spiritual teacher in the Marine Corps. It was like out of nowhere, just all of a sudden I had a spiritual teacher.
And you'll have to tell this story. I heard a little bit on your amazing podcast with Rich Roll, but it's worth telling because it's such it's so crazy to think that first of all, you found one in a science class, and then second of all, you found another spiritual teacher in the Marine Corps. Yeah. And it's very interesting.
Yeah, when he revealed himself to me, I thought, wow, they're hunting me. I can't get away.
I'm being stalked.
I can't get away from these people.
Yeah.
So this was Sergeant Robert Throneberry, Vietnam vet, tough. He was an intelligence guy, so he interrogated the Viet Cong kind of guy. And so he did crazy stuff all the time. I think one story I told about the Ghost Platoon, is that the one you remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Ghost Platoon was. I should say that in any platoon back in those days, we had about 80 guys. 20% were called Percies, which is guys who joined the Marines on a spiritual search. And there's a lot of them, more than you can possibly imagine.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the others are called the Johnnies, which is the guys who I don't want to work at the warehouse anymore. And the judge said it's either jail or the Marines. So they're the Percies and the Johnnies. Okay? Now we're all good Marines.
Yeah.
A Percy was just as tough as a Johnny, but the Percys were on a spiritual search. Okay. So he noticed me. And anyway, so just to get to that story. So we're outside the chow hall and we're all at attention. They're backed up. So we're just standing. He says, oh, you think just because there's a backup of the chow hall, you get to stand here and do nothing? He says, we're going to do the rifle, the order, it's called the order of arms. When you move your rifle throwing situation to the next. He said, I drilled a platoon to death and their ghosts are right here. And there's ghost rifles, on the deck. So everybody pick up your rifle. So we all pick up our ghost rifles. He says, so then he kind of looks at me and says, does everybody have the right rifle? So I got the cue. I said, sir, this private does not have the correct rifle, sir. So he says, who in the hell has Private Finley's rifle. So one of the other Percy's like, got it. Oh, game time. He says, sure, this private has Private Finley's rifle. Why don't you just give that rifle to Private Finley? Right? And so, the other guys are like, what's happening here? What is going on?
Right.
So one of the most remarkable things he did was when we were in the infantry school. So this is right after Vietnam. So we were like staging ambushes. And the thing with an ambush is absolute, complete quiet.
Mm-hmm.
You don't sneeze, you don't breathe, because otherwise everybody gets killed.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are, practicing an ambush, and a guy starts to scream. So it turns out that he was terrified of snakes. And it doesn't matter if you're terrified of snakes. A snake can just crawl right over your head. It doesn't matter. You're in an ambush, right?
Sure.
Okay. So we're all lined up, and he somehow gets a hold of a snake. And he calls Private Johnson, and he has Private Johnson hold the snake, by two hands. And he's like in his ear, when I give you the word, when I give you the word, when I give you the word. And he's like getting all hyped up. He says, bite it. And Private Johnson bit the snake in half.
Whoa.
And then he said, now rub the blood on all the other Marines. And I thought, wow, this is like some primal. This is like,
for sure.
This is primal stuff, man. So he walks up and down the platoon, and just like we all get a little bit of blood wiped on our face.
And that was Private Johnson was the one who was terrified. He was the one who screamed.
He became Private Snake Catcher.
Yeah.
And so then for some reason, he needed another snake catcher. Okay. So I don't remember how it happened, because I knew that he was Private Snake Catcher, but then he yelled out, Private Snake Catcher, and for some reason Johnson was there. I really don't remember why. And if you don't run up to the duty office, we all do push-ups until somebody shows up.
Right.
Like he would say, Private Swordsman, whoever knows something.
Right.
So he says, Private Snake Catcher. We're all looking at each other, and we know he's going to come out and say, get on your knuckles. It's like, what the hell? So I just pounded the door. Sir, Private Snake Catcher, reporting is ordered, sir. And so he has a snake in a can. He says, I need you to charm the snake and tell the snake to quit biting the privates of platoon 3077. I said, sir, can the private go get his snake charming gear? so I go back to my footlocker. My parents sent me my prayer shawl, okay? So I come back. I sit on the floor in, crisscross legs. I put the prayer shawl over my head. I began chanting the Friday night service to the snake. And the snake comes out of the can, it's like a coffee can, and looks right at me. He goes, okay, tell the snake. I said, snake, go tell all your snake friends to stop biting the privates from platoon 3077. He says, okay, dismissed. Right?
Wow.
I know, huh? So it was like he was off the chain,
Yeah.
And we got to play along.
Yeah.
So that was my boot camp experience.
It's so interesting to see where things are hiding in different places where you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
And there's probably a lot of people who had the same commander as you, or same sergeant as you, who didn't get it.
They just thought he was weird.
They just thought he was weird. They didn't get it.
And harsh.
Right.
He made me like an orderly. One last boot camp story. So I got a little too familiar. I said, sir, how long did it take the sergeant to get from private to sergeant? He looks at me and says, are you implying that I was ever a despicable private like you? I said, sir, the private apologizes, sir. So he choked me out, rear naked choke, passed right out. So, when you pass out, you're still like aware of reality, but you're unconscious. It's
Sure.
a weird thing. So he yells out, 2 privates come forward to retrieve Private Finley's body. So a couple guys dragged me up, put me under my rack, and I'm saying, wake up, wake up, wake up. So I finally wake up, like resurrection from the dead. I just get up and clean my rifle or something. But this is the stuff he would do. So there were a lot of guys that were terrified of him.
Of course.
I was just so impressed.
Yeah.
Like he used the fact that he had 80 captives to just play with our minds, because he said, one time he said, war will play with your minds.
Sure.
I'll play with your minds here. Because when you get into war, like the war I was in, you better be ready.
Yeah.
Right. So for him, it was all about, physical conditioning, good Marine Corps skills, and breaking through the limitations of consciousness for those people who could get it. So,
I can see why you and Steve Pressfield have a lot of conversations that must be really interesting, because you hear all of the stories of, Sparta, and you hear the stories of how they would hone the mind very much as the body. Like this is such a mental process. And of course, everything that happens with the elite operators, the special forces, all of this. Yes, of course, the body's involved, but it's really the mind.
There's body, skills, and there's like next level thinking.
Yeah.
And how do you break a person into next level thinking? You have to, in a way, deconstruct their reality so they can get into next level thinking. So I understood what he was doing. I understood that he was basically disassembling our reality for those of us who could track him.
Right.
And I was awestruck by the brilliance of this guy. He must have been all of 25 at the time. I think about it. I was 18, he's probably 25, 26 years old, right? You know, decorated Vietnam vet, you know. And
did you ever look him up in your later life?
I tried.
Yeah.
I tried. You know, when the internet came,
yeah.
And I went looking around, and I finally found a guy around the right age, you know, name, and I, you know, like when email came into being, and I sent him an email, he said, "Sorry, I'm not your sergeant." It could have been he, because on the last day of boot camp, he came up to me and said to me, Private Finley, I was a PFC at the time, but so you're still called a private. He said, "Do not come looking me up, because if I have to send you to your death, I will. So we can't be friends." That was his last words to me.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, you've had two powerful mentors.
Yeah, at least two.
At least two.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
so,
and I can say the same. I mean, I think that's the thing. You find, if you're really paying attention, the mentors are around, and the mentors are looking for someone who's paying attention. That's the thing, right? It's like, everybody's like, how do you find a mentor? How do you find a mentor? Be the mentee.
Yeah.
Like, be the mentee looking, and you'll find it, and they'll find you.
And it's not what you think it is.
Right.
It's they're around, and there has to be a matchup. You know, it's I mean, I've met spiritual geniuses in the strangest places. When I worked on a kibbutz in Israel, so I worked I volunteered to work in the citrus fields. So we get up super early in the morning, and there's this one guy who's like, I could just tell he's like a deep guy, and I finally, my Hebrew got good enough, and I just wanted to know, like, who are you? And he said, I walk on the black earth, and I just know. That was it. That was our full relationship. But you know what? I detected him.
Yeah.
And he detected me enough to know he's going to tell me something.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. And the thing is, you once you start looking, there are people who are operating at a different level, all kinds of places.
Yeah.
And you got to trust, in a way, that knowledge. I mean, that's an interesting theme that we've developed here, is the importance of teachers and the importance of allowing yourself to be a mentee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, let's carry on with the journey through the different emanations. Okay. So we've gotten
Chesed and Gevura.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so then the next one is, in a way, the intermediary between those, and it has two names. Some call it emet, which means truth, and some call it tiferet, which means beauty. So Chesed and Gevura resolve into truth and beauty. So that is just so. I mean, I forget which poet said at the end of Ode to a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth and truth is beauty, and he finishes somewhere. So this idea that somehow these are inherently connected concepts, that beauty communicates a truth, and truth communicates a beauty. So just first at the words as labels of inner realities. So then when I teach this, part of it is teaching the idea of truth. Well, first of all, there are that your words correspond to reality, and then the truth of the human condition, and the truth of the depth of human consciousness, and the truth of the divine, and the truth of the moral law. So there are so many levels, and people get hung up on the empirical level. Truth is, there's no mystical reality, there's no metaphysics. Yeah. Truth only means that words correspond to reality. And it's much more, man. It's like, it's the minute you start peeling away a concept like truth and then go to beauty. So people say to me, isn't beauty in the eye of the beholder? Where in the eye? Like the cornea? I said, it's a metaphor. What are you trying to say? Okay, so they, oh yeah, you're right. It's a metaphor. Never really thought about that.
Right.
So isn't beauty subjective? I said, nobody talks that way. When I see a beautiful painting, I said, I don't know if the painting's beautiful, but I'm having an experience of beauty. You say, the painting is beautiful. That's just the way we talk.
Sure.
So when we say beauty, we're saying it as if there's a quality that inheres in something. And I'm not going to torture the English language enough to say, beauty doesn't inhere in things outside of me. So I don't buy into subjectivism.
Right.
So they say, well, what makes something beautiful? I don't know, except that I didn't make it beautiful. Somebody else made it beautiful. All I did was perceive it. So once you realize that truth and beauty, and this is a very big argument in today, as you can imagine, it's a huge thing today, isn't all truth subjective? And my answer is no. Truth's like beauty.
Right.
It inheres. And when we perceive it, and then people say, well, I heard that all truth is subjective. I said, you'll excuse me, but you heard wrong. I don't know. You want to do like the long route or the short route? Because if your claim is that all truth is subjective and all beauty is subjective, I'm not going to try to argue out of it. You know, that's like, okay. But if you want to understand truth as a metaphysical reality and beauty as a metaphysical reality, there's a way to get there.
In my own journeys, I've really kind of felt as if God, love, truth were synonyms in an interesting way. And that there was all of those different concepts really worked together in the same way. Love is always true. With God is always true. Truth is, they're all kind of a different way to describe.
Well, the way I phrase it is,
thing.
and this is totally Kabbalah, because remember, Chesed is love.
Right.
Gevurah is justice, judgment. And Tiferet is truth and beauty. So I say love, justice, truth, and beauty are the garments of God.
Yeah.
And so what does God look like? I say, look at God's garments.
Yeah.
Love, justice, truth, and beauty. Then I extend by saying the good, which is how they all operate, and then the holy. So I've refined it since I was a younger man. I would say love, justice, and truth, and beauty are the garments of God. And they're garments of the philosophic good, that to which we human beings ought to aspire.
Yeah.
The experience of it is the holy, and then behind that is the divine mind.
And beauty is interesting because beauty it inspires a sense of awe and a sense of wonder. Wow. Like that's the response when you see something, a beautiful painting. Wow.
Correct.
Beautiful sunset. Wow.
Correct.
And that is the only natural response to looking at God.
Precisely.
Wow.
So beauty is an awesome experience.
Yes.
And sometimes when you read something profoundly true, for example, you'd be watching a movie and they cut it exactly right. And you say, there was more truth in that scene just now than I reflect in any philosophic book I read. I mean, I really love cinema, and I just love it when the casting director and the writer and the set designer, and they all conspired to create a moment where this pulsing with truth and beauty, and you can see the metaphysical reality coming through the screen. Yeah. It's overwhelming. So was that truth or beauty?
Same.
It's the same thing, yeah.
I interviewed Matthew McConaughey, and did you see the movie Interstellar?
Yes.
So the scene where they've just gone to that planet and he's lost 40 years and he has all the recordings of his daughter growing up and his son growing up, and he's just lost all of this time. And he's sitting in the chair trying to just reconcile with the fact that he's just lost whatever it was, 30, 40 years. And he was talking about that moment. That was one of the most powerful moments I've ever seen in film. And it's very simple. It's just a close up, of him going through this experience. But it was true. And when he talked about it, he talked about how he got into that, and he just passed a note, and he knew that he was just going to deliver that scene, and it was just going to be one time. And he said, because anything after the first time would have been acting. Like, wow, this time was true. Everything else, I would have been acting.
Wow, that's incredible.
And when he said that, I was like, fuck, that's right.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly right. This was true. When you did that wasn't acting. You were really there.
I love him. Now, he was in True Detective, right? Okay, so did you watch the series?
No.
Okay. So at the end of...
Was he in True Detective? Yeah.
With Woody Harrelson. So Woody Harrelson plays the drunk
Yeah.
cop who's like burnout, and Matthew McConaughey, you don't know if he's a mystic or if he's psychotic. We don't fully know. But toward the end, there's this one scene where he's right between mysticism and psychosis, and then they show us the world that he sees, and you start to doubt, well, what is psychosis other than a break with mundane reality? And it was, I mean, I watched it in awe of him, everything. I mean, so I remember that moment more than Interstellar, because sometimes I'll watch the series to earn that moment.
Yeah. I got to see it. I
Oh
got to
man,
watch it.
it was True Detective, and another favorite of mine is the TV series Fargo. The movie was great, but the TV series,
I saw a little bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first 3 seasons of the TV series, every single one of them had those achingly true and beautiful moments. So I think now our perhaps our greatest art form right now really is is television, where they can actually develop something through 8, 10 episodes. So I'm really a fan of great, deep, edgy television.
I think the art reflects what the culture really loves the most. I mean, there was a time when sculpture was what culture loved the most, and there was some amazing. You look at a Bernini or you look at a Canova, and you're like, oh wow, this is unbelievable. When you see the Daphne and Apollo, and you see the way that the hands press into the flesh, even though it's made of marble, and I remember staring at that one in the Rata Persephone, the Rape of Persephone. I'm looking at these like, oh my goodness.
It's as if they're compressing all of reality into something physical, and the reality is. Did you ever read Rilke's poem, "The Headless Torso of Apollo"?
No.
Okay, so when the Muslims invaded Greece, they didn't like images; so they cut the heads off of the statues. So down there's a statue. It's called the Headless Torso of Apollo because the head's gone. So he's looking at the torso and then trying to imagine the head, and he leads you on this path of what it means to experience something and then experience the absence of something. And it's just an awesome, maybe 10, 12 lines. And then there's skip a space and it says, you must change your life. You will shudder.
Wow.
When you read, because of your appreciation of sculpture, when you read The Headless Torso of Apollo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. There was a time with sculpture, for me, it's mostly poetry. And, and scripture. And now I'm just in awe of, what cinema can produce. So I feel just a beneficiary of, living at a time when there's so much, beauty in the fine arts, and beauty in music, and beauty in the written word, and beauty in cinema.
And we still have access to different times when someone could spend 4 years on a sculpture or a couple years on a painting, and not worrying about whether they had to sell it because they had a patron, and just a whole different world that we get to still appreciate that beauty if we're willing to. If we're willing to go there.
Churches, I just read a book called Beauty. It's called Beauty, A Very Short Introduction. So he goes into the debates, and so I looked up everything he mentioned, and I went into photographs of churches that I'd never seen before, but they're hidden all over Europe. Astounding works of art. And the fact that he introduced it to me, he says, look how the column resolves into a robe, which resolves into an octagon, which turns into an art. So no one ever taught me how to look at, at architecture as poetry. So I'm looking at this stuff and saying, wow, man, this poetic urge is, in which the presence of the divine is compressed and flowing through. It's
such a shame that this understanding of beauty and the essence of beauty being divine was not translated through all of the religious dogma, where different forms of art were suppressed, different forms of dance were suppressed, different forms of song were suppressed, even the act of love making, which is an incredible gateway into the divine if you're doing it with the right intention, right? And all of these things were cast aside as, oh no, these are bad, Well, if they're beautiful, they're pointing, they're a doorway to God. They're a portal to God, you know, if they really are beautiful and the intention is there. And that, if that would have permeated through everything, I mean, the whole world would be a different place.
Yeah, it's, I wonder, the couple times I have been in Europe, I've gone into cathedrals and they're overwhelming. And they found a way around it because the sculptures, for example, of the I think it's called a sarcophagus, when they have an image of the person inside. I mean, the images of the women that were buried there, I mean, it was like, for a dead woman, it's like, that's you guys are pushing the boundaries here. So you would go under the cathedral into the mausoleum, and you'd have these, the images of all the royalty that were buried down there. I mean, it was stunningly, stunningly beautiful. And then you look at the same cultures that create the most poetic and architectural beauty can become savage.
Yeah.
At an instance of a demagogue or something. So I wish that beauty made people immune.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think there's no replacement for hard work on consciousness.
Yeah.
There's no shortcut.
Yeah.
If you want to be a just person, you got to work on truth, beauty, and love. You want to be a loving person, you got to work on justice, truth, and beauty. It's like, for me, those four, you got to stay hard at work on love, justice, truth, and beauty, because they all entail each other.
Yeah. I mean, it actually goes back you can even talk about the pyramids again, right?
Exactly.
Beautiful. And actually, if you go talk about the mystical purpose of the inner chambers in this acoustically resonant void where people could connect to the mystery of all of the divine. All right. Well, yeah, beautiful. Made by slaves.
Exactly.
Right. It's like you got some of it, but nonetheless, how many died? How
Precisely.
many? This was built in death and blood,
and so here we have the kind of ironic, tragic beauty of the tragic compressing of the human condition. And so, when I think of my work as a spiritual teacher, drilled down into a rabbi who's shifting into wisdom for everybody. For me, it's one Marine at a time, one cadet, one person at a time,
and maybe one hood at a time.
Exactly. Well, but my students aren't as bad as that. But,
yeah, sure.
I want them to see the mystery, just like there's a soul in your home. It's not the spouse you're arguing with. There's a soul trying to get out, and are you ushering that soul out? Are you obscuring that light?
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Let's continue on the journey.
All right, man. You want to do some more Kabbalah?
More Kabbalah. Yeah, let's go all the way down to to the end here.
All right. So so you have Chesed and Gevurah concentrate into Tiferet Emet. Okay, so it's a triangle. The next triangle is called Netzach, which literally means victory, but the interior is prophecy.
Okay.
So prophecy means some people speak words that convey the presence of God. Some do and some don't. So the idea is there are people that when they talk, when they speak, and you attend to it, you can feel God's presence coming through. So it's the reality that there are spiritually gifted among us. So so the word is Netzach, which means victory, but the interior is prophecy. So you might say divine force pushed out through language.
Right.
So notice Chesed is a force. Gevurah is a container. They resolve into Tiferet Emet. Goes to Netzach, which is both force and form. The force and form of language. Okay. Right across from Netzach, there's the one called...
Sounds like almost even embodied language. Like the language as it comes through a vessel. Because the words can be empty, but the words can be full.
So Martin Luther King's speech.
Yeah.
Somebody else could have read it. We wouldn't remember it.
Right? Exactly.
No, I mean, I was a kid when I saw that on television.
Yeah.
It changed the country.
Yeah.
You want to see a moment that changed the country? That moment changed our country. I mean, that was a prophetic moment.
Yes.
Where everybody watching it, just about everybody watching it, changed their mind.
Yeah.
So that's prophecy.
Yeah.
Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so exactly, it's the words with the power of something behind it. So notice if Chesed and Gevurah are force of love, the form of good judgment, mediated through Tiferet Emet, truth and beauty, then that goes into prophecy. Okay, isn't it beautiful the way the system works?
Yeah.
So right across from Netzach is called Hod, which is another word for beauty, but here it has more sense of architectural beauty. So you have the prophet and the priest.
Mm-hmm.
So the priest, is in the cathedral. The priest is in the temple. So you have the power of the word and the power of the form of beauty. Think of architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I counsel myself because I'm much more of a word person.
Mm-hmm.
But then I look at the space in which I live, and my constant challenge is to make the space in which I inhabit look like a work of art.
Mm.
And I tend to have a messy desk and books strewn about, and I say, no, my space has to reflect the beauty that I've experienced. That's my challenge. So whenever I give my talk on Netzach and Hod, prophecy and architecture, that's usually my talk to myself.
Right.
And a lot of people resonate to it. A lot of people say, yeah, I kind of bulldoze through life and one thing after the other, and I never stop and build a cathedral. I never stop and turn this into a work of art. So that's a very deep teaching for me. Those two resolved into what's called the Yesod, which means foundation. In the Kabbalah, it actually refers to sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to lift it above sexuality, and I try to think of how all of these become present in the human personality, including sexuality. Because you can take erotic sexuality and just understand the Greek idea of eros, which is human bonding. So it becomes personality, object relations, how our interior connects to the world, including sex. So when I teach Yesod, it's down to how does this shape your personality? Okay? The next one is the goal, because the next one is the brokenness of God. It all gets broken. All this beauty, it gets broken, and we got to put it back together. So the last one is called Malchut Shekhinah, and again, it's very complex. There are so many ways to teach it, but ultimately it means the sovereignty of God, but the interior of it is the broken sovereignty of God. So sometimes when I teach the Sefirot, I go the other way out. I say, let's start with our brokenness. Now, under your brokenness, what's the truth of your personality trying to get through? So everybody has a personality. Everybody has a version of the divine. Okay, now we'll go up into the architecture, then over to prophecy.
What about the sexuality?
That too.
Because it seems like there's that really actually is deeply connected to our brokenness in many cases. What I've seen in
all of them have a version of brokenness. So
right.
So that's where when one goes from brokenness into Yesod, people's sexuality can be purely gratification oriented.
Sure.
It can be it can run into troubles because of glitches in the human brain. But let's say
and conditioned shame, conditioned judgment, conditioned performative, conditioned ideas that this is the essence of who I am, my sexuality, how I perform is how I am as a man, or whether I'm attracted. Like there's a lot that can get really squirrely there in that emanation.
So interesting. I'm just a heterosexual male, and I love my wife.
Yeah.
And I've never really thought. I assume. I don't really care about somebody's gender identity. Do you love somebody?
Right.
Are you kind to each other?
Right.
Is it expressing your sexuality? That's all I need to know. Like I'm really not interested in anything else.
Right.
So I'm kind of a simpleton.
Yeah.
In this stuff. But when it does come down to it, if I'm really getting into the kind of the intimate life of another person, we will talk about how sexual energy gets communicated.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are very shut down. Some people are way too present, and that's something they need to work on.
Mm-hmm.
So, but for me, it's part of personality.
Sure.
So Freud said it all was rooted in sexuality. I think some of it is rooted in sexuality.
Agreed.
Because I'm more of a Jungian than a Freudian. I see the gods operating within us and trying to manifest in our different personalities. When I think of Yesod, I go more on the path of Carl Jung than Freud.
Mm-hmm.
And that that's been forever. So I've never really occurred to me that there's a different way to think about it, because, when a person says, well, I have this trauma from my childhood, which is why I do this. And I say, maybe the God of war is living in you. Maybe you're a warrior. Maybe you weren't traumatized. Maybe, this one guy said, I'm always anxious when I'm closing a deal. I say, you sound like a man on a hunt. Every tribe needs a hunter. So there's no problem with wanting to close deals. Are you fair? Are you honest? Are you keep your contracts? Okay, so you're after deals. Like the hunter from which you are descended, thank God that guy was in the tribe that did not give up until he closed the deal and brought some, meat back. So anytime a person says, oh, I'm this, I try to go to the tribe and ask myself, who is that person in the tribe? Like the anxious person, I say, we're putting you on the hill to keep an eye out for the enemy. Right? So
the scout.
Exactly. You want an anxious person up there. When a person says, I have anxiety, and it's because of that, I said, who knows? Maybe anxiety was the most important thing in the tribe from which you're descended, that somebody would not fall asleep on guard duty.
And lifting that judgment from all of these things actually allows it the freedom to breathe and potentially the freedom to alchemize. And they say, oh, okay. Because when you judge something, you actually strengthen it.
You strengthen going back to Pressfield, the nature of it becomes a force of resistance to enlightenment. And this goes back to the idea of the brokenness, that whenever a person says, oh, this is bad about me, I said, you discover your life's work. So when you look at the Sephirotic system, and some people more gravitate to one than the other, and they say, wow, I really don't love well. And I say, that's the brokenness that God gave you. So now your job is to repair yourself, repair the vessel of God that you are. This is the Lurianic Kabbalah, where we are each given brokenness so that we can repair ourselves, repair each other, and repair God. So this is the idea of the divine brokenness. So, I remember when I thought that, when I had issues of why am I like this and this is not good. And I thought to myself, it's just my brokenness. It's just my life's work. I don't get super serious about it. I got work to do.
Right.
Like when I get up in the morning, I got my work to do, and I got my real work to do.
And a big problem comes when you start comparing yourself to somebody else, not appreciating that they have their own brokenness and they have their own life work, and your work is just different than theirs. And again, it goes to that value hierarchy that we always try to create. Well, theirs is better than mine. Well, no, it's not. It's just
when you're really tied to your work, there's no envy.
Yeah.
There's no comparing. You're so busy with your work, you don't even have time to start comparing yourself to your neighbor and coveting what your neighbor has.
Right.
The focus on spiritual work is one of the healthiest things that people can do. Is the main thing I want to do is refine my spirit and work with my character and repair these broken sphirot in my system, and be as present as I can to the people around me, and be a channel of love, justice, truth, and beauty, the good and the holy. And that's enough. That's enough to keep you occupied.
For sure. For many lifetimes.
Yeah, for many lifetimes. That's exactly right.
When you talk about the foundation as the emanation, obviously there's the place that you're in. So, you create a home, it's a house or it's a home. And there's certain elements that make it a home where somebody comes in, and one of the things, my home is filled with different artifacts and art and different things that I've collected through all my journeys. And we have some, nice furniture and different things, but people walk in and they go, oh, wow, they feel something in there. And and I feel something in there. And that's what I've tried to cultivate. That's really clear. Is there also a point where your foundation is your physical body, like this temple?
Very much so.
And so your jiujitsu practice, your jiujitsu black belt, I don't think we've talked about that yet today, but that practice or your physical health. And because this becomes ultimately our ultimate temple. So how you take care of yourself. Exactly.
So, there are great Jewish medieval theologians that start with the health of your body. And then through that, the health of your emotions and the health of your character. So they see them all as connected. This is nothing new. This goes back to the medievals, and it goes back to the Greeks. People really understood that the foundation is the way you treat your body. So my connection to jiujitsu is a way to embody myself, because I spend so much time in an ethereal, metaphysical world. So the idea of being physically connected to other people through sparring, Like there's nothing metaphoric about sparring, you know?
Yeah.
There's nothing as real as a tap,
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know? Like
For sure.
it's real.
Yeah.
And so I love the fact that I do something so physical where there's no ambiguity. I mean, there's skill and there's grace and there's art, but somebody taps or somebody doesn't, or it's a tie,
Right.
you know? And just the satisfaction of, I'm a good practitioner. My game gets better. I elevate that's the job of higher belts is to elevate the games of the lower belts. That's our singular job. There have been guys that have been brown belts too long. They didn't understand because their skill is greater than many of the black belts. And we can't tell them. It's because you're not committed to the game of people that are of a lower rank.
Right.
When you get that, you get your black belt.
Right.
And so
because that's the higher principle of service. That's the higher principle of love.
We're in service to the discipline. That's exactly
right. Rather than just trying to smash everybody to prove how good you are.
That's, you know, what the black belt who taps to a white belt, they're working at a very high level of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
You earned it, you get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also a shame too that, you know, I think a big challenge has been that people have created a value hierarchy where spirit is more important than body. And so you get these asceticisms and renunciate paths where they just let the body go to waste. So it's all about the spirit. Well, the body is the physical manifestation of spirit, you know? And so when you create this hierarchy and say, oh, you know, God's up there and not down here in this lowly little body. Well, that has
been
issue.
one of the problems of the, you know, the idea that the body is bad.
Yeah.
You know, the spirit is to connect to God and the urges of the body are somehow evil. You know, that dichotomy, that's been very bad. That's really messed people up.
Yeah.
I mean, I've counseled a few young men who grew up in very devout religious homes, and they're very ashamed of their physical urges. And, you know, part of my job is to say, oh, wait a second here. You know, like, it's not the fact that you have these, what do you do with it? Like, it's beautiful if you make it beautiful.
Yeah.
But because they feel the urge and someone told it's bad and that's shameful and, you know, you should, you know, it's, you know, only get married as a way to subdue your urges. And, you know, those kinds of teachings, I think are really somewhat disfiguring for the human being.
Sure.
You're really interested in Yesod. I really like it because I kind of like passed through that and you're really making me stick to it. And I like it because you grasp foundation.
Yeah.
And you're bringing it out to so many different aspects. So, I mean, this is your entry to the Sfirot. I feel it, that's your way into all of them, is how do they all translate into a foundation?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is isn't it the brilliance of the system, you know, infinite generative point of consciousness, the quarry of language, love, justice, truth, beauty, prophecy, architecture, Yesod, brokenness of God. It's an infinite system to sharpen our minds and spirits. You know, you come down, you go up, you come down, you go up. It's infinite. So I really thank you for having me take the time and lead you through it because
I thank you. I mean, as you said, I've never encountered a map that was as interesting and deep as this. And this is something where a little bit of work, and I've actually seen it. I've seen it.
Yeah, you've seen the map, right?
I've seen the map, and it has its own geometry, and it's laid out, and there's little nodes, and then there's lines that connect the nodes,
Correct.
and there's this whole process. But without this understanding, without my time
You're stuck
spent
with
here,
labels.
I'm like,
What is
this? I don't know what this is.
You've really done a good job in eliciting it, because I don't think I've ever done this in my life, is sat down and gave the whole system one sitting.
Well, excellent.
Yeah. No, really. I said, wow, you really want to go the whole way? All right, man. But the main thing is the labels are not the interior.
Of course.
And what you've done is you've drawn out the interior of each label. I can see that you're getting the deeper interconnections between them and what a lifelong study of this could produce. So...
Well, I feel excited. I actually just got goosebumps. But I'm excited. You know, I'm excited to just this entry into this path, and also my own roots and my own, and being able to. There's something there. There's something there. There's a reason why. I don't know if there's a reason, but for whatever reason, if there is a reason, I was put in this Jewish lineage body in the Jewish tradition family, and now something else is coming to me where it's like, all right, this is now, and all the work that I've done and all the journeys that I've gone on, it seems like just a beautiful opportunity, an invitation.
Yeah,
let's
thank
say,
you.
an invitation.
Well,
to this.
the last words that my high school teacher said to me, I came back from overseas and I tracked him down. I went to his kind of a hovel, where he was like illuminating it with his brilliance. And he was teaching me, he says, you know what, Finley? He said, my roots are Danish. He said, you really got to go back to your people. There's stuff in the Jewish tradition that you don't know that you have to go find. He said, like, we're done.
Wow.
And it was a blessing. You know, go forth.
Yeah.
Like to Abraham, go forth to a land that I will show you. And so he kind of said, hey man, like we had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we love each other. And now go find your way. Back in your traditions. And I was 21, and within 2 years, I was teaching Kabbalah.
Yeah. There's in a lot of the different traditions that I've been involved in, ancestors are a big part. Whether it's a Native American culture, whether it's a Peruvian culture, or Shipibo, or these different cultures that I've been, aware of. You talk about the honoring of the ancestors. And for me, that's always been something that's difficult because, I had family that, passed on to me, but I don't think of them like ancestors. There's a certain reverence that I've never really been able to feel. I'll do it, I'll honor the ancestors, but it's been more like the husk.
It's
and
so
not the
interesting
kernel.
that you say that. I don't think we Americans have a sense of ancestry.
Yeah.
We have to really try to create that. Because, my father was not born Jewish. He converted right before my bar mitzvah. And the last 10, 15 years of my life, I've tapped into my Celtic ancestry. And so I've studied books on Celtic spirituality, and I don't want to leave it behind. My father's father was Irish, and my father's mother was German. So there's a German Protestant background. So I'm deeply embedded in the Jewish tradition, and I know I have ancestors that were Talmud scholars and Kabbalah scholars, but there's another group.
Sure.
And I don't know if this knowledge is passed on genetically, but they're my ancestors.
Right.
So I'm going to take it seriously.
Right. Yeah.
Like I went like people from 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Said, wow, so our wisdom is still pulsating into the world because of our descendant.
Yeah.
It's a big thing.
Yeah.
That we channel the ancestors. Yeah.
Well, my grandmother would be very happy that I'm sitting here right now with you. And just thank you so much for this conversation.
This has really been truly delightful, and I did not know what to expect. I looked you up, and you are not your image. You are so much more. I want everybody to know right here.
Thank you.
This is really special. Really, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I feel very much in my heart that this is just the start of a very warm friendship.
Outstanding. I'm up for it, man.
All right.
Very good.
Thank you, everybody. Much love. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. Follow me at Aubrey Marcus. Check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere. And leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.